Well, President Obama and Hillary Clinton taking heat for these comments about ISIS.
We now finally are where we need to be. We have a strategy and a commitment to go after ISIS.
This is not a huge industrial power that can pose great risks to us.
Really? Are Democrats underestimating ISIS, and how would a Republican in the White House respond? Let's talk to one who would like to be in the White House. We're talking about Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio, who joins us today from Rochester, New Hampshire. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning.
Well, what do you think about Hillary Clinton saying at the debate? I know you didn't see it because nobody did. It was on Saturday night before Christmas. She said, regarding ISIS, we're where we need to be. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's one more example of how government, Washington, and particularly the Democratic Party, is completely out of touch with reality and out of touch with the American people. The vast majority of Americans understand that this threat is not under control. In fact, it continues to grow in both scope and sophistication. And she's talking about how we have a plan. What exactly is, how is that plan any different than what we had in place a month ago or 2 months ago when the president was claiming that ISIS was contained, and then a few days later they attacked Paris, and then less than a month later they attacked San Bernardino, or at least had this terrorist attack in San Bernardino. So it's just another example of how out of touch they are and how clueless they are, and quite frankly how dangerous their foreign policy has become for the national security of this country.
Well, Senator, when you hear the president say that ISIS doesn't pose a great institutional systemic risk to the United States, it certainly explains why people are feeling unsettled, because the reality is that they do. How do you respond to his comments today?
Well, he's trying to compare them to countries. What he's saying is, oh, they're not an industrial power, they don't have this large economy or this large military industrial complex. That's true. They pose a very different kind of threat, and that's what makes them so dangerous. If they were an army that had headquarters and army bases and a navy, we'd know where to attack them. But they're not just an armed terrorist group, they're also an insurgency. They control territory in a vast number of countries, but they're also using propaganda to radicalize people, lone wolf attackers and so forth, whom we may never even be able to identify until it's too late. So again, it's another example of how this president misunderstands. He just doesn't understand the threat that we're facing. He's comparing them to a country when in fact they've taken on elements of a terrorist insurgency, very different and very sophisticated and very different than any threat we've ever faced.
Were you surprised by Secretary Clinton during the debate doubling down on her support of the president's policies against ISIS? She got defensive about it.
Yeah, and she's in a tough spot, obviously, because she was the Secretary of State for 4 of his 7 disastrous foreign policy years. And the truth is that the threat of ISIS began to emerge in Syria while she was still the Secretary of State, and of course fully blossomed right after she left. Again, it goes back to the point, they're all circling the wagons because they're all responsible for what's happened here. They're completely out of touch with how Americans feel. Now, how did the American people supposed to feel when they feel as vulnerable as ever to these terrorist attacks? And you have a president and a leading contender for the Democratic primary arguing, oh, everything's going great, we've got this really good plan in place, and it's starting to work. They live in 2 different universes.
Sure. Well, what about the president in this interview on NPR that's being run this morning where he says, ISIS is out there, but don't let it change the things you do in your everyday life. I mean, there are a lot of people, Senator Rubio, who, when they go to the mall, they wonder, how safe am I there? Or they go to the movie, they wonder about that. Or they send their kids to school, they worry about that too. What's your message to the president about don't change anything, we're going to be fine?
Well, look, after San Bernardino, I personally know people, at least a couple of people over the last few weeks that have told me they've changed something they're going to do because of all this news about ISIS and so forth that's out there in the press. I think rather than scolding the American people about it, sure, I think people should go on about their lives and so forth, but I think he also needs to do a better job of recognizing how uncertain and insecure people feel, and it doesn't help when they turn on the television or on their radio and they hear the President of the United States, whose job it is to keep us safe, sounds so out of touch with reality about what's going on in the world and what's going on in their lives. I think what they want to hear from the president is, yes, this is a significant new kind of threat. It is something we're going to have to confront. It'll be hard, but we can do it, and we will succeed in the end. Instead, he's out there telling us everything's fine, there's nothing to see here. That's not what people feel in their lives, and when they see a president so out of touch, it makes them more scared, not less scared.
Senator Rubio, we know you have a busy day ahead in New Hampshire. We thank you for sharing some of your time with us here at Fox & Friends. Great to see you.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks for having me.
Merry Christmas.